DNA testing kits have exploded in popularity over the past several years. For a fee, you can spit into a tube, send it to a company like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, or Family Tree DNA, and the company will reveal your genetic background in a pie chart. The pie chart tells you all about yourself, except that it really doesn't. No, it estimates your ancestry through DNA markers and haplogroups, and describes your blood through a listing of cultures. It's like having a deeply uncomfortable conversation with Measurehead from Disco Elysium, only you did this to yourself on purpose. The pie chart tells you about your blood, but lists it through recognizable cultures: Italian, Scandinavian, etc. This pie chart means nothing, because blood is not culture. Culture is culture. If you live in the United States and have no cultural ties whatsoever to, say, Mongolia, know nothing about Mongolia, and nobody in your family has ever talked about being Mongolian or have practiced Mongolian culture with you, and the first time you ever discovered your extremely distant Mongolian genetics was when you spat in a tube, then guess what? That pie chart that says you are 2% Mongolian does not mean you get to claim to be Mongolian. Claiming to be part of a distinct culture because of something that happened 1,000 years ago on the other side of the planet and completely unknown to you until you saw a pie chart is something white people do to give their homogeneous, milquetoast existence that little extra flavor that they desperately desire. There are legitimate reasons to trace your DNA. For example, your results could reveal predispositions to diseases, but these results can also be uncovered through medical practitioners that will be more confidential with your DNA sample than 23andMe. A DNA test kit might also help you find your birth parents, but for everyone else, the goofy pie chart really is the main attraction. Now that we understand that the main reason that people use DNA testing kits is meaningless, we need to ask ourselves if it is worth it. I don't mean worth it because of the cost, I mean worth it because of the risks. I would never get my DNA tested. Never have, never will, but not because of the aforementioned reason, although that certainly would be enough. No, the reason I would never use a DNA testing kit is that it's dangerous for all of us. DNA testing kit companies are complicit in violating our privacy, our bodily autonomy, by collaborating with local and federal law enforcement. DNA testing kit companies assist law enforcement in the creation and expansion of DNA databases, the perfect tool for an authoritarian police state. Law enforcement has been extending itself in this way ever since DNA evidence and DNA profiling became standard tools for the police in the late 20th century. As explained by Tania, Simoncelli, and Sheldon Krimsky in the book Genetic Justice, Databanks, Criminal Investigations, and Civil Liberties, although the notion that an employer or insurance company should not have access to our genetic information has been codified as law, law enforcement's authority to collect DNA has ballooned over the last decade. Most recently, people arrested by federal authorities and in select states, whether ultimately convicted or not, have been having their DNA routinely collected and permanently retained. Also, law enforcement officials are increasingly collecting DNA from individuals surreptitiously, the presumption being that if a person has abandoned his or her DNA, they have a right to collect it, analyze it, and perhaps use it as evidence against that person, all without a search warrant or the person's knowledge or consent. Protection of DNA information in the criminal justice context appears to be operating under a different set of principles than that of health or employment. So, what are some of these surreptitious ways that police are collecting your DNA? The police cannot simply demand that you submit your DNA under all circumstances, as there are some legal protections. One way is this: anything that is deemed abandoned and/or in a public place is no longer your property. Police abuse this dictate by offering suspects a cold beverage during interrogation. After drinking it, the suspect has probably left DNA from their mouth on the can or cup. Once the can or cup is discarded, the law says that it is abandoned and that anything found on it is fair game. Another way police abuse the abandonment rule is by going through our garbage and finding DNA evidence there. Although this appears to be a violation of the Fourth Amendment, if the suspect is not in police custody or under arrest while officers rummage through their garbage cans, then police can claim that their rights during this period were not violated, and that any search through the garbage was only a search of abandoned property. As secretive and diabolical as this might seem, the courts have largely held up law enforcement's right to steal your DNA. So, what do law enforcement agencies do with our DNA besides trying to link us to crimes? They create databases full of our most private genetic information. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System. It's maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but it's more complicated than that. There are local DNA databases where police departments input DNA samples that they stole from your garbage can and other sources. There are state DNA index systems that share information among the local databases, and the National DNA Index System that shares information among the states. Combined, it's called the CODIS, and it's terrifying even if you have no reason to think that the police are after you. Many states have approved the use of familial searching, which allows someone to potentially be charged with a crime because that individual's DNA is related to the actual perpetrator. It's also terrifying because it grants previously unheard of power to law enforcement, and there is no reason to believe that it won't be abused. As explained in the book DNA and the Criminal Justice System, the amount of personal and private data contained in a DNA specimen from which the profile is drawn makes its seizure extraordinary in both its nature and scope. The DNA being held by federal, state, and local governments can provide insights into the most personal family relationships and the most intimate workings of the human body, including the likelihood of occurrences of thousands of genetic conditions and diseases. DNA may reveal private information such as legitimacy at birth, and because genetic information pertains not only to the individual whose DNA is sampled, but to everyone who shares in that person's bloodline, potential threats to genetic privacy posed by their collection extend well beyond the millions of people whose samples are currently on file. CODIS is apparently not enough of a power grab for law enforcement. They want more. The police don't want to wait until suspects are, suspects. Instead, they want to collect as much DNA information on the population as possible, turning everyone into a potential suspect. This is some sci-fi pre-crime bull. The end goal is a complete DNA profile of the entire nation. In 2002, Interpol created their own international DNA database. Interpol assists member nations with law enforcement, so there is reason to believe that the real goal is actually a complete DNA profile of every member nation. To accomplish this dystopian nightmare, law enforcement agencies have begun to take advantage of commercial DNA testing kits. People with no criminal record have begun voluntarily giving up their DNA, legally abandoning their genetic profile and bodily autonomy. You ever read those terms of services when you get a new phone app, or really anything? Yeah, probably not, right? The company behind the TOS is counting on that, and the companies behind your commercial DNA test kit are counting on that too. The fine print on a commercial DNA testing kit generally says that your DNA results can be used against your interests, and that is so vague that it covers law enforcement demanding access to it. You might scoff and say that it's their own fault for not reading the Terms of Services, but unless you have read every word of every Terms of Services agreement in your life, maybe try to have some sympathy here. Nobody reads the Terms of Services, and even those who do will probably not clock that used against your interests really means that the FBI wants your blood. It's so far-fetched that it's not something that anyone considers, but it's actually kinda true. Also, even if someone reads the Terms of Services, understands the consequences completely, and agrees to take that risk, that person's relatives probably did not agree to that, and that person's relatives are now in danger. This does not only concern the individual who gives the sample, it concerns that individual's parents, siblings, and other relatives. They did not sign up for this. As explained in The Lost Family by Libby Copeland, BuzzFeed News reported that Family Tree DNA was allowing the FBI to search its database for relative matches of crime scene DNA to identify perpetrators of certain violent crimes, as well as the remains of John and Jane Does. It was early 2019, and the company told BuzzFeed that it had been processing crime scene samples for the agency in its lab and uploading them on a case-by-case basis for several months by that point. A number of genetic genealogists who had regarded Bennett Greenspan's company as one created by a genealogist for genealogists said they felt betrayed. Judy Russell, a former lawyer and newspaper reporter known for her blog The Legal Genealogist, pointed out that Family Tree DNA was giving law enforcement access in many cases to genetic relatives' full names, email addresses, and family tree information. Alright, let's back up. How does this even happen? Can a local police officer just press a button and get your DNA from 23andMe? No, not exactly. These DNA testing companies all have guidelines, and they seem to fall into three categories. A company may be completely forthcoming and offer law enforcement access pretty much whenever they want. A company may be less forthcoming and offer law enforcement access purely on a case-by-case basis. A company may be even less forthcoming and only offer law enforcement access with a search warrant. Even in the scenario of the third category, your DNA is still not completely safe. The company will still grant access against the interests of unsuspecting people. Worst of all, we are not 100% sure which DNA testing company is following which guidelines. And even when we do find out through some public expose, those guidelines can always change, as they did with Family Tree DNA after they were exposed. It's your DNA, not your credit card information. If your credit card information is compromised, you can have it canceled and get a replacement. If your genetic information is compromised, you can't replace it. Your DNA is you, forever. Even if you are not the slightest bit worried about law enforcement overreach for whatever reason, you should be aware that insurance companies may use your DNA against you even if the cops don't. As reported by National Public Radio, in general, long-term care insurers can indeed use genetic test results when they decide whether to offer you coverage. The Federal Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act does prohibit insurers from asking for or using your genetic information to make decisions about whether or not to sell you health insurance or how much to charge you, but those privacy protections don't apply to long-term care policies, life insurance, or disability insurance. Let's sum up. All those DNA testing kits, not worth the risk, especially considering how little you get out of it. With rare exceptions, they are only good for creating a pie chart so that you can lie about being a living embodiment of diversity. With few legitimate uses for these DNA testing kits, is it really worth the risk to yourself and others, like your relatives? Is it really worth the risk of creating a DNA database for law enforcement, a sci-fi dystopia in modern times? I would say no, it is not. I watched a local news station interview a woman who used one of these kits to find a distant cousin, and she says it was worth the risk to her insurance, but the interviewer never brought up the larger risk. News media doesn't like to side against the police state. With that in mind, we have to take better care of ourselves and make decisions to protect our communities, and I'm sorry, but that might mean not finding out that you're 2% Portuguese. Frankly, it's a small price to pay.